For longtime viewers of the channel, you all know I love a good HDMI mod, and over the past few years we've seen quite a few come out. But most of these have been for 32-bit consoles and newer, with older systems not getting the same attention. Well, that all changes with a kit called the Megaswitch HD, which brings beautiful, super crisp, actual high-definition video to the Sega Genesis. And I have to say, the results are pretty incredible. So we gotta check it out. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. Today we're going to be taking a look at a really awesome HDMI kit, this time however for a 16-bit console, the Sega Genesis. It's called the Megaswitch HD and it was created by a very talented modder named Stalinslav. This kit is a true digital-to-digital video solution, giving us a pristine, extremely sharp image from a Sega Genesis or Mega Drive system. This isn't just some cheap analog-to-digital converter. What makes this kit unique is that it uses an FPGA to emulate the Genesis video processor. That means everything else in the console is still doing the heavy lifting except for video processing. The reason for this is simple. The Genesis doesn't output a digital video signal that we can tap into like some of the more modern consoles out there. So the FPGA takes over video processing, generating a true digital output while the rest of the console operates as normal. All that is to say is that the results speak for themselves, and that high definition badging that's emblazoned on the console shell finally has some true meaning. Okay, so in this video, we'll take a brief look at the components of the Megaswitch HD mod kit. I'll then show you how to install it, go over all of its features, discuss the pros and cons, and of course provide you with my overall thoughts. So the kit comes very nicely packaged and well organized. It's sort of stacked in layers with plenty of foam, so it'll definitely arrive in one piece. The first part we run into is called Board A. This attaches to the bottom of the Motorola 68000 processor, which is at the beating heart of the Genesis. Below that we have Board C. This is sold as a separate kit and is completely optional. I'm actually not going to be installing it in this video, but what it does is enable Sega Master System support through HDMI. And here we have Board B. This is where you'll find the full-size HDMI port as well as a USB-C port. The USB-C port will be primarily used for updating the firmware on the Megaswitch HD. Now this last set of parts we have is the ADC board here on the right, which is needed for tapping the audio signals from the Genesis motherboard. And here on the left we have a DC to DC converter, which will be used to power the Megaswitch mod. As you can see, this is a pretty extensive kit that comes with pretty much everything you need for the installation, including the wires, ribbon cables, and mounting hardware. Now please note that what you see here is actually 3 different kits that are each sold separately. We have the main Megaswitch HD mod, the ADC kit which allows us to pipe audio through the HDMI port, and we have Board C, which again is used to enable Sega Master System support through the HDMI port. Now to complement the Megaswitch kit, we just can't put it back into its original shell. Instead, we're going to use this stunning one from the folks over at Retro Game Restore. This particular one was graciously sent over to the channel from Rondo Products, and I absolutely cannot wait to see how it looks on the Genesis. And lastly, you'll of course need a donor Model 1 system, with this one here being a VA3 model, which is one of the supported revisions of the Megaswitch mod. Okay, so that's pretty much everything I'll be using for this Genesis build. Now before we jump into the installation, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's video, PCBWay. If you have an idea for a new mod or want to assemble an open source project, PCBWay provides you with the tools to make them a reality. From 3D printing services in an array of materials, all the way to other services like CNC machining, injection molding, and of course PCB and flex ribbon fabrication. So when it comes to taking your retro mods to the next level, PCBWay is the place to make that happen. Check out the link in the description for PCBWay to get $5 off your first order. And again, a huge thank you to PCBWay for sponsoring this video. Alright, so obviously we're going to start off by tearing down the console. Now one thing to note is that I'll be installing this into a VA3 Model 1 Sega Genesis. This mod only works on Model 1 systems, so be sure to check out the Megaswitch website to see if yours is compatible. If I recall correctly, the Megaswitch is supposed to work with any Model 1 that has a VDP chip with marker 3155313. And as of now, no Model 2 Genesis is supported. Now, when removing all the screws, don't forget this one here that's hidden underneath the audio jack board. I always seem to forget it. Sweet, with the motherboard removed, we'll also need to remove the heatsink. We actually won't be reusing this one since the new shell comes with one. And as you can see, this is indeed a VA3 console, and depending on the model you have, your installation will be a bit different, so definitely refer to the Megaswitch website, which has very nicely made install tutorials for each of the revisions. First order of business is to remove a bunch of parts like the EM components, an inductor, some ferrite beads, a capacitor, the crystal oscillator, and of course the RF modulator and expansion port. These are all through-hole components, so I'm just going to be using my desoldering gun to make quick work of them. And here's everything all removed. This is where board B will eventually be installed. So here you can now see me laying down a few of the capacitors flat to the motherboard, and this will create additional space for the HDMI board or board B when we do put it in. Next, we'll need to install this tiny flex cable to the VDP chip. As you can see, I already connected the 8-pin ribbon cable to the connector so that we don't have to do it later on, as it's much easier to do it now. And here is where we're going to need to solder in the flex cable. I like to line it up perfectly and then tack it in place before soldering it in fully. This flex cable is much smaller than some of the other kits I've installed in the past and a bit easier to get in, but it does still require some experience with soldering, and I wouldn't recommend this for first-time modders, so definitely do proceed with caution. And this is what it should look like when completed. Next, we're going to need to go ahead and lift the third pin from the right on the Motorola 68000 processor. We're eventually going to need to solder in a resistor in series. Again, I'll be using my desoldering gun to remove the solder, and then I'll pull the pin through. We can then go ahead and install the included resistor in series. And here's a close-up of what it should look like. Now we can go ahead and bring our attention to the bottom of the motherboard below the 68000 processor. Since board A will go into this location, we need to relocate this capacitor so that it can sit flush. I'll just be using some wires to extend the legs and move it further away. Then I'm going to go around and trim off some of the pins that are sticking out too far so that we can again have board A stick as flush to the motherboard as possible. Then I'll go ahead and use some Kapton tape to insulate the components and pins so that they don't short against the board when we install it. Now before we proceed, I'm going to go ahead and install all the wires we need onto the bottom of the board before we install board A. This will make it easier to install them later on. And the first wires I'm going to be installing are to pin 13, 14, 15, and 16 on the cartridge connector. This will give us access to the button controls, which we need to access the OSD menu. And here I'm soldering a wire to the fourth pin from the left on the VRAM module. Next, we'll need to remove this resistor here, which is part of the reset circuitry, and replace it with a 4.7 kilo ohm resistor, and also solder a wire to it. This is needed because the reset button is used to allow us to update the firmware on the Megaswitch. Great, next we're going to go ahead and cut the traces between jumpers JP2 and JP4. This will allow the Megaswitch to change the region on the Genesis using the integrated menu system. To ensure that we did sever the traces, I use a multimeter to make sure there is no continuity. And then on the other side of the motherboard, we're going to solder a wire as shown to both JP2 and JP4. Alright, so back to the underside of the 68000 processor, you can see that we have all the Kapton tape in place and the area is prepped for the installation of our board A. This is going to go ahead and line up with all the pins on the 68000. Make sure that they are all aligned properly and that the board is oriented correctly before proceeding. Now just go ahead and solder in both sides. And this is what the finished result should look like. Again, I would recommend using a multimeter to ensure that all these connections are solid. Next, we're going to now solder in all the wires to board A. This includes the button signals from the cartridge connector, the VRAM, and the reset button. And then over here, we'll connect the other end of the wires from the JP2 and JP4 jumpers. And lastly, we'll solder 2 new wires to the 3-volt power input and ground. I'm using a slightly heavier gauge wire for this. Now, apologies for this angle, but what I'm doing here is connecting the other end of the ribbon cable that's coming from the VDP to the board here. And there you have it. This is what board A should look like when it's fully installed. Now, pro tip, you should route the button control wires to this side of the rivet on the cartridge slot, as you don't want it to get pinched when installing the motherboard into the shell. Alright, so next we're going to go ahead and install the DC to DC converter. Take note of the in and the out through holes. You're going to want to solder wires to each of these points, and the Megaswitch instructions actually provides the lengths you'll need. And in my case, both the in wires need to be about 6 centimeters, with the out wires 9 centimeters. And with the wires soldered in, you'll need to insulate the converter. I'm using Kapton tape, but electrical tape or some heat shrink tubing will work just fine. Next, we're going to need to locate capacitor C79, which is where we're going to be pulling our 12 volts from. And then solder the positive in wire to the positive side of the capacitor, and the negative in wire to ground. Great, now we can start connecting some of the ribbon cables. The straight one that comes with the kit will go here, and the longer one with a 90-degree bend goes here. You'll definitely want to make sure they are fully seated before locking them in. Next, we're going to go ahead and take the straight cable and bend it to a 90-degree angle such that it lines up with the other one, and with the tip of it about 8 millimeters below it. Just note that this doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. Now we can flip the board over and connect the other ends of the ribbon cables to board B. This is a bit of a finicky process, but again, make sure the ribbon cables are fully seated before locking them in. If they're not fully seated, you may have some video signal issues. Ask me how I know. Next, we'll go ahead and solder the 2 out wires from the DC to DC converter to board B in their corresponding through holes. This is what's going to be powering the Megaswitch. And then we'll also go ahead and solder in the other 2 power wires coming in from board A here as well. Fantastic, now comes the mounting hardware, which are 2 brass standoffs that will go where the old expansion port used to be. Now let's go ahead and grab the included shielded wire, which will be used to connect board B to clock. You absolutely have to use this wire because it is shielded, otherwise the mod will not work. The outer shielding needs to be connected to ground, while the inner part of the wire is connected to clock. Okay, board B is pretty much fully installed. Now would be a great time to attach the 2 heatsinks that came with the shell to the voltage regulators. And be sure to use some good quality thermal paste before attaching them. Now, before we move on, let's do a quick test to make sure the mod is working. Fantastic, looks like everything is working as it should, so now we can proceed to install the audio ADC, which will give us audio through HDMI. First thing we're going to do is solder in all the wires, one for ground, the left and right audio channels, and then one for the 3-volt input. I definitely recommend using different color wires as that will help with the install. Then we're going to need to temporarily unmount board B so we can install the ADC. I was a bit lazy and I just slipped it in there. You'll just need to make sure that the headers are oriented as shown before soldering it in. Then route the 3-volt power wire from the ADC and solder it into the 3-volt through hole. Just make sure that the other wire from board A does not detach, as both are drawing power from this point. And then we can go ahead and solder the other end of the audio wires to the headphone jack board, with ground on the right side, the right audio channel in the middle, and the left audio channel on the left. Great, now we can finally start to install everything into the shell. For the power jack, Retro Game Restore includes this plastic disc and screw to keep it in place. Now this here is the rear I/O panel, and I tried to remove the plastic tabs with a flush cutter, and that turned out to be a big mistake because I ended up cracking it. The plastic is very brittle, so I recommend maybe using some other method to remove the plastic tabs. Now you will need to salvage the cartridge throat, power switch slider, and reset button from the original case, unless you have some other replacement ones. The Retro Game Restore shell does not come with these components. And to finish the build off, I went ahead and placed the included 16-bit decal onto the shell. These have a really nice metallic finish and look fantastic. I really love that Retro Game Restore included these. And there we have it, our Megaswitch modded Sega Genesis. Alright, so I have to say that right off the bat, the video quality is fantastic. The installation itself was a bit challenging, but the results are well worth it, and I really do hope we see more 16-bit consoles get the same HDMI treatment. Now before we dive into all the features, let's do a quick side-by-side comparison of the Megaswitch HD mod, RGB video when connected to my RetroTink 4K, and of course just regular old composite. Note that the RGB video is completely stock without a triple bypass mod. And again, I have to say that the Megaswitch HD definitely looks like the best out of the three. All three of these video captures are coming from the same Sega Genesis, and by far and away the Megaswitch output is the most crisp. Now I decided to also compare the Megaswitch HD to a triple bypass modded console, and I still think it's safe to say that the Megaswitch HD is still sharper. The triple bypass modded console is connected to my RetroTink 4K using HD Retrovision cables. This was pretty much the gold standard in terms of video output quality for the Sega Genesis, but the Megaswitch certainly does have an edge in terms of sharpness. Either way, both the triple bypass modded console as well as the Megaswitch HD have great video output quality, but I do think the slight edge goes to the Megaswitch. Anyway, now let's go ahead and deep dive into the features that the Megaswitch has to offer. Much like many of the HDMI mods out there, the Megaswitch also has an OSD, or on-screen display menu. In order to access it, simply press and hold up and start at the same time for a couple seconds, and the OSD should pop up. Now, as you can see, I'm running firmware 1.27.1, which is the latest version as of the making of this video. So the first option we have is resolution, and as of right now, the only option that we have here is 1080p at 60 frames per second, which at least for me is perfectly fine. It would be cool, however, if they added a direct mode that would allow us to connect to an external scaler to do all the video processing externally, but I digress. Going back to the main menu, and under screen size, we can adjust the aspect ratio between 4:3 and 16:9 to fill the whole screen. I do think most of us will opt for the 4:3 option, as that's the proper ratio for the Sega Genesis. For height, the default appears to be 4.857, which gives you a perfectly filled vertical display, but you can fine-tune this to your desire all the way up to 5 times integer scaled, and as low as 4 times integer scaled, with everything in between. Now, going back to the main menu, we have the buffer setting. Here, you can change the output mode from 0 delay to single buffer. I believe this has to do with when the video output switches between 240p and 480i. Using the 240p test suite under the single buffer setting, you can basically get near instantaneous switching between 240p and 480i, while under zero lag, you get about a 2 to 3 second delay when switching. Between these two settings, I think I'll stick with the single buffer mode since that does seem to have less distracting transitions between the two resolutions. Let me know down below in the comments if I'm missing something here regarding this setting. Now back in the menu under the advanced settings, we first have something called mask, which blacks out the frame that's usually around the image. To better show this, I'm going to go ahead and change the vertical stretching to 4 times. I do think this is a really nice feature that cuts out all the unnecessary stuff in the image, which can be distracting. And speaking of which, you can also disable the CRAM dots, which are those flickering dots that appear at the bottom of the screen. If you enable the mask, it actually makes them go away too, but for those that prefer to keep the mask off, you have the additional option of keeping or removing the CRAM dots. And the last option we have in the advanced settings is the dither blend mode, which as you can see sort of blends adjacent pixels like the ones in this area to smooth them out a bit, and I kind of like the way this looks, so I do think I'll be leaving this one on. Moving on to the post-processing setting, we have quite a few things we can tweak. First up is the color. There are a lot of things we can adjust here, but honestly the default setting, at least to me, looked the best, so I just decided to keep it as is. The amount we can change here is pretty daunting and really beyond my comprehension, but I'm sure there are some of those out there that could take advantage of these settings to really dial in the color. I'm just not one of those people. And back to the scanline settings, here you can add, well, scan lines. There's only one option to turn them on and off, and I don't think it looks particularly good, so I went ahead and just left it off. Now the scalar option here doesn't change the resolution, but instead is basically a smoothing effect to remove the pixelated look of the image and give you more of a cartoonish blended look. I'm not a huge fan of this option, but maybe some of you out there will like the way this looks. Now here under the audio settings you can change the sampling. I actually thought I messed up the installation of the Megaswitch because the audio I was getting sounded really weird. But it turned out that my sampling was set to 96 kHz, and my capture card was not able to process this properly. Switching to 48 kHz completely resolved the issue. So moral of the story is if you notice any problems with your audio, check this setting first before messing with the hardware and rechecking how you installed the kit. It could save you a ton of time. And the last setting category is system, and here we can do some pretty neat things. Under hardware, you're able to change the region of the console between the US, Japan, and PAL. This worked perfectly in my testing, and as an example, while playing Streets of Rage and switching between the US and Japan, it resulted in a language change as well as a title change from Streets of Rage to Bare Knuckle as it was called in Japan, so this is a pretty neat feature and I'm glad that they included it. Also, when changing the unit to PAL, you will see that the HDMI output will change from 1080p at 60 to 1080p at 50 to be compatible with PAL displays. And here you can also change the hotkey prompt for accessing the menu. It has a built-in keypad tester, and a way to revert back to default settings. All in all, I think this is a pretty nice and comprehensive amount of settings that Stanislav integrated into his Megaswitch mod. Now outside of the OSD, the Megaswitch is compatible with the Sega CD add-on, as well as running Sega CD games off of a Mega EverDrive. However, do note that running a 32X will not be compatible with the output through HDMI, but using a standard AV port will of course still be supported. And like I mentioned previously, if you want Master System support through HDMI, you will need to purchase and install Board C. If that's something you'd like to see me install, definitely let me know down below in the comments. Since it is a smaller mod, I'll most likely showcase that on my second channel, which if you haven't checked out, what are you waiting for? I'll leave a link to it down below in the video description. Anyway, those are the primary features of the Megaswitch. Now let's get into the pros and cons. Starting with the pros, I think we can all agree that the video output quality is pretty spectacular, even when compared to a triple bypass modded system using HD Retrovision component cables and a really nice scaler. It's just absolutely stellar. Additionally, I love that it can run both analog and digital video at the same time, which can be an ideal setup for streamers or those who just like to hook up their Genesis to a CRT monitor or a modern HD display. Another pro is that for the most part, this is a completely reversible mod, just make sure you keep your old components. However, I wouldn't classify this as a no-cut mod, since you do have to cut traces on the board for the region switch functionality. But these can be easily jumped later on since the motherboard does have jumper pads which can be easily bridged. And as far as lag is concerned, according to testing done by RetroRGB, the kit exhibits essentially zero lag, which is fantastic. I'll leave a link to the RetroRGB article that goes over this down below in the video description. And lastly, with regard to the shell, I think it looks stunning. I've always been extremely happy with Retro Game Restore shells, and this one is no exception. There was one drawback, however, which brings me to the cons. Now, the only issue I had with the shell is that the included I/O back panel is made of some very brittle plastic, and I accidentally cracked it when prepping it for the install. Now, perhaps there was a better way to remove the tabs more carefully, so I don't think I can entirely blame the brittle plastic. However, this is something I want you all to be aware of, so you don't make the same mistake that I did. Now, thankfully, there is a nice 3D printable I/O cover that's designed specifically for the Megaswitch. So for now, I'm just going to be using the one I 3D printed from my personal 3D printer, but probably sometime in the future, I will get a translucent resin one from PCBWay using their 3D printing service, which will fit the clear shell a lot better. Now, probably the biggest con is the installation itself. It's definitely challenging, but that's typical of these HDMI mods and to be expected. However, the Megaswitch does have some rather unique inconveniences. For one, I wish the ADC was integrated into the main HDMI board. That way, you don't have to undo parts of the original install just to add audio through HDMI. If the ADC was integrated, you would essentially only need to install one kit instead of two. Also, while I didn't install the optional Master System add-on, I did take a look at the installation instructions. It seems that in order to install this kit, you do need to further modify the HDMI board by removing some components, meaning you need to undo the HDMI mod in order to install it. This again seems like another inconvenience. As an add-on kit, I would really like to have been able to add it on without undoing previous mods. Again, this is just a minor gripe and not really that big of an issue, especially if you don't plan on installing the optional SMS add-on. And lastly, there's price. This is of course not a cheap mod. The Megaswitch HT itself is $150 with $16 for shipping. And if you want to add in the audio ADC, which I strongly recommend you do, that's another $20. And the clear shell from Retro Game Restore is another $120. So all in, this is a very expensive build, with each of these kits individually being pretty pricey. Overall, I do have to say this is an amazing kit, and I absolutely love that we can now enjoy the Sega Genesis in glorious high definition. And, at least for the time being, this appears to be the only 16-bit console that has a proper HDMI mod. So one can definitely say, again, at least for now, that Sega does what Nintendon't. Well folks, there you have it. The first and only digital-to-digital HDMI mod kit for the Sega Genesis. So what do you all think? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so definitely drop them down below in the comments. Now if you enjoyed this video, I really think you'll like this one here, so check it out. And as always, thank you all so much for tuning in today, and I'll catch you again next time.